So here we go. Welcome, everyone. I am really excited to host another event in the New Media and Contemporary Culture series. And today I have a real treat for you, Professor Thomas Poole. From the University of Amsterdam, who is a co-author of Platforms and Culture Production that was published almost 3 years now at the Platform Society, absolute classic when it comes to platform studies. He co-edited the Sage Handbook of Social Media and Social Media Materialities and Protest and the Global Cultures of Contestation. Thomas, I'm really honored to have you here with us, and I can't wait for you to share with us your most recent research.
Great. So thanks, Bartos. Thanks very much for having me. And I very much look forward to all, people's questions and so on. Would be great, Bartos, if you could keep your camera on so I can have someone to look at when I'm speaking.
Yeah, it
That's
would be
always very
nice.
helpful. And if more
Yes.
people can turn it on, that would be even better. So maybe a couple of people, it's very nice to, talk to faces rather than sort of empty space. All right, so I'll share my screen. Um, Here we are. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, excellent.
Good.
So I'll get going. So today I would like to talk to you about um, two projects, and they're very interconnected. And so, as an overall title, I've chosen Global Perspectives on AI Platforms and Culture Production. So, part of it will cover the book, which Bartus referred to at the start already, Platforms and Culture Production, and then a new project on which is called Global Perspectives on AI and Creative Work. All right, so let's get going. Um, I want to do this in two steps. So the first step, I'm going to focus on the book, and the book really is about how has the integration of platforms in culture production transformed the cultural industries. And this is a project I've pursued with two colleagues of mine, David Nieborg and Brooke Aaron Duffy. And it kind of tries to develop a theoretical framework to both examine the institutional dimensions of platforms and platformizations. I'll talk about what those institutional dimensions are, but also how they're connected to practices of cultural production. And then the second part talks about this new project on global perspectives on AI and creative work, where we specifically choose not to focus on the US or Europe, but look at other parts of the world to try to rethink some of the central notions in work on culture production and technological change. But let's start with platforms and culture production. So this is a book we've written in a period from about 2020 to, well, maybe 2019 to 2021. And it presents an analytical framework that very much builds on research on the Anglo-American world and Europe. So it kind of also has sort of carries resonances of those institutions, cultural practices, histories, and so on. All right, so I would like to take you through a couple of key notions which are important for developing our analysis and our arguments, and which hopefully, and I think they are, useful for other scholars, but which also might be rethought. So I'm happy to talk about these also critically. Um, so the first one concerns the notion, obviously, of platforms, which is very central to a lot of current research on sort of cultural industries, but also a term that's often not clearly defined. And we're trying to clearly define it. And doing so, we build on a number of different traditions of research. One of them is business studies, which is not really part of media studies, but which has developed a lot of important research and conceptual work on platforms. And then we draw also on critical political economy and software studies, which are very much in the media studies tradition, as well as in the book on media industry studies and uh, cultural studies. So building on these traditions, we define them platforms as data, or sometimes we call them computational infrastructures that facilitate, aggregate, monetize, and govern interactions between end users, content, and service providers. And this definition has sort of three key components, which we really use, which we understand as what I call the institutional dimensions of platforms. And those are obviously the infrastructures, data or computational infrastructures, the platforms as markets that facilitate, aggregate, and monetize interactions, and then finally, platforms as governance frameworks that really govern, shape the interaction between end users, content, and service providers. So that's the definition. And then if you look at platforms, well, actual existing platforms out there, we can obviously think about YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, but also the Apple App Store as a platform. So it clearly constitutes a market that aggregates and enables and also enables the monetization of interactions between app developers and end users. These interactions are then afforded by the Apple App Store's data infrastructure that allows app developers to upload their apps, by now about 2 million of them. But Apple also closely governs the App Store. I mean, Apple is obviously famous for its strict governance, which means that it vets or curates every app that's uploaded to the store, and sometimes it also rejects apps that are that people want to distribute through the App Store. But it also governs in other ways. So it provides software development kits to developers that allow them to build on the Apple or the iOS platform, and that come with all sorts of standards that basically shape what app developers can do on the platform. And of course, there are developer agreements, guidelines, and documentation. So in all sorts of ways, it governs these interactions. All right. So then we have this the process of platformization. So we the central idea of the book and also earlier work which we've done is that platforms basically extend themselves to other sectors of the economy. So in the platform society, which writers referred to in the beginning, which I've written with José van Dijk and Martijn de Waal, we look at a variety of different sectors like education, healthcare, transport, but also journalism. And here we specifically look at the extension into the cultural industries. And we understand this process then as the penetration of digital platforms, economic infrastructure, and governmental extensions into the cultural industries. So here you can recognize the three institutional dimensions of platforms, right? As markets, infrastructures, and governance frameworks. And then it also platformization also refers to the organization of cultural practices of labor, creativity, and democracy around platforms. So it's not simply an institutional process, it's also one that's very much sort of driven by cultural practices. So societal actors, in this case, cultural producers, but also consumers, sort of reorient themselves, reorganize themselves around platforms. So platformization then is a process, and of course it's very much connected to this other process, which well, many people have done research on digitization. But what we're arguing is that digitization is a broader process and does not necessarily coincide with platformization. And that's important to keep in mind because it allows us to distinguish platforms and process of platformization from sort of digital entities which are not necessarily functioning as platforms. So, for example, the New York Times or Netflix or Walt Disney collect loads of data, at least they're sort of online entities, collect loads of data, use very sophisticated algorithms to curate their content, but we do not consider them as platforms, but rather label them as media or entertainment companies. And they're because they're primarily in the business of producing and licensing original content and are not, and here this is sort of the key point, they're not directly economically and infrastructurally accessible to third parties. So to put it very bluntly, video producers, small or big, cannot freely upload their clips to Netflix in the way they can, for example, to YouTube. So that's very important because it's um, the sort of infrastructural and economic openness of platforms sets off particular dynamics, which are very important for understanding this process of platformization, which I'll talk about in a minute. All right, so this is where we get to the argument, where these things really start to matter, these definitions and these distinctions. So our starting point of the argument is this sort of this research which was very prevalent in the 2000s, so from about 2004 until 2010, 11, which understands platforms really from the perspective of democratization, emancipation, and participatory culture. And here on the slide, you can see a couple of sort of typical books, very influential and also very interesting, written in that time that really make that argument that these platforms are sort of instruments or of democratization, emancipation, and participation. So if you then think about platforms and the way so that frame, obviously we've criticized that very extensively in the platform society, but also here in this book, because it's a naive understanding of platforms. But we also still want to sort of hold on to part of sort of that analysis because we think it's very important in understanding the way in which platformization sort of intervenes in a variety of sectors to understand the opportunities that platforms offer to cultural producers, right? To find audiences and generate revenue. So even though the democratization frame or perspective is simplistic, it is important to acknowledge these opportunities because otherwise it becomes very difficult to understand the drawing power of platforms, right? So they've been now over the last 6, 7 years, they've been so extensively criticized that sometimes it's easy to forget that they actually do provide real opportunities to actors that previously were not able to market and sort of target their content to global audiences, which they now can. So in that sense, we can so these open platform markets and infrastructure, relatively open, appear to facilitate a decentralization of power within industry segments, right? Individual producers, creators, journalists, game developers, musicians that can now circulate and monetize their content. But of course, as I said, right, that's a relatively naive point of view, and that needs to be complicated. And the complications really come in when we start thinking about platforms as markets, right? What kind of markets are these? And important to consider then is that they're in no way neutral, right? They're in no way without hierarchy. They are actually very, very, very hierarchical. And to understand these hierarchies, we use or build on a concept very central to business studies, which is the notion of network effects, which says, I mean, to explain it very simply, if you succeed as a platform to attract a lot of end users, you become very attractive for other end users who find their friends, family, and colleagues on the platform. But you also become very attractive for content and service providers as well as for advertisers. And those dynamics, those effects also work the other way around. So the more content and service providers there are on the platform, the more attractive the platform becomes for end users. So these dynamics reinforce each other, which then leads in these different sectors or segments of the economy in which platforms intervene to what you could call winner take all dynamics, where only one or two or maybe three platforms tend to dominate an entire sector. So YouTube dominates long form video, TikTok short form, the Apple App Store or iOS and the Android and the Google Play Store. So they dominate the app economy, Facebook and the sort of social media networking, Google search, and so on. So winner take all dynamics, which means that these particular sort of dominant platforms become unavoidable for the actors within particular sectors. So if you take news organizations, which I work quite a bit on, they might not like Facebook or Instagram very much, or Meta in this particular case. But they need to work with these platforms to be able to draw online readers and in some cases also to some extent monetize these readers. So in that sense, we see enormous concentration of economic and financial power in a few platform companies. And interestingly enough, in these platform markets, so if we consider Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or YouTube as a market, we can also see within those markets winner take all dynamics. So we can see that a couple of individual or well, news media organizations, sorry, particular news media organizations tend to become very visible on these platform markets. And why is that the case? Is because platforms tend to reward actors that engage, that generate a lot of user engagement and making them more visible, right, through their algorithms, which then leads those actors to become visible, which leads to more engagement, which makes them even more visible. And what we're seeing now that so the platform economy has become more consolidated, that especially organizations that have lots of resources, so that work with talent agencies, that have partner programs, data tools, and also brand recognition. So the typical media organizations, which were also already quite large in the 20th century, like the Walt Disney, Bloomberg, the News Corp, the New York Times, also are very dominant or very visible in the platform economy. So we're kind of seeing a repetition of those sort of power relations. And yes, there are sometimes individual creators that become winners, but they then often start to build on these resources as well. They start to work with talent agencies. They become more sophisticated in data analytics, and they become brands in their own right. So in that sense, we see a sort of a consolidation of power. And of course, that comes with a given that there are only a few of these dominant platforms, that really comes with a lot of control in the hands of a few, right? That are able to set the standards, that have control over data, that can sort of manufacture visibility. So a concentration of economic and political power in a few platform companies, but also consolidation of economic power in a few large media companies. And then maybe the final part of our argument in the book is that that concentration of power in those platform companies is putting cultural producers, especially the smaller ones that have fewer resources, in a highly precarious position, because platforms constantly tend to change their infrastructures. So they constantly adapt the way in which third parties in this case, culture producers, can work through platforms, changing their algorithms, changing their software development kits, changing access to their data through the APIs, changing their terms of service, and so on. So once they do these, well, sort of introduce these changes, cultural producers have to adapt. And so they are sort of engaged in a constant process of adaptation in the platform economy, which is very exhausting and puts them in a really precarious position. So that's the argument from the book, and one that's not too optimistic, but one I think which really provides a sort of realistic assessment of the current sort of power relations in the platform economy pertaining to cultural production. All right, now I want to turn to the second project, which really tries to move beyond sort of the way in which we have so far studied, uh, well, cultural production and technological change. And we have very much studied that, and we've done that as well in our book from the perspective of North America, or maybe more broadly, the sort of Anglo-American world and Northwestern Europe. Which also means that sort of the central notions which we use, such as platform economies, capitalism, platform governance, but also notions such as precarity, creativity, democracy, are very much sort of tied to those regions, right? To those histories and to those um, practices. So what we want to do is in this new project develop case studies as an opportunity for theory building. So not necessarily just using the set conceptual framework, but try to rethink these notions. And doing so, we think that this shouldn't just be the responsibility, which so far it has mostly been, because this is obviously not a new project. This is something that builds on decades of post-colonial, decolonial theory and attempts to sort of de-Westernize media studies and also other fields in the humanities and social sciences. So this has been so far mostly responsibility and effort of Asian, African, and Latin American scholars, we've done great work. But we feel that it's very important that it's also taken up as a responsibility by scholars who are working in Europe and the US, especially because a lot of the work that's done in those regions often implicitly, not necessarily explicitly, but implicitly assumes the universality of their theory, right? So work that's done in Europe or the US often does not do the work of making explicit how specific the observations are, which are coming from the US or the UK or, well, Germany often also for that matter. Whereas people who work on other parts of the world, including Poland, often have to make that effort, right? Explain how their work is actually quite specific to that particular region. And from our perspective, that work needs to be done by everyone, right? So we need to understand sort of the specificity of the observations we're making and the theory we're producing. So this then leads to what we call global perspectives on AI and creative work. To this notion of global perspectives is an effort really to multiply our frames of reference and have other frames of reference. In this particular project, which I'm developing with colleagues who you can see on the slide, who are specialists in and speak the languages in Chile, Brazil, Nigeria, India, and Japan, which are obviously very large countries which have very vibrant cultural industries and are now in different ways also integrating generative AI in their cultural industries, but which are often not key reference points in our theoretical debates in the field. Right? So the effort is really to develop them as key reference points. So I want to take you through one example and then sort of think about a couple of sort of central notions in our thinking about platforms, AI, and cultural production. And so this is an example from Japan on the anime and manga industry, which is kind of interesting because it's been quite aggressive, especially the last couple of years, in integrating generative AI in its production process. So this is an example. This is an early example from 2021. Toei Animation, one of Japan's oldest animation studios, used AI-powered background image production tool, Signify, to produce this experimental movie, Orvan, which it sort of tried out, well, whether it could use Gen AI, sort of, especially for background image production and coloring of characters and so on. So this is interesting. I mean, so this is a very early example, but one that actually builds on a longer tradition of integrating digital technologies in manga and anime production. So you can see 3D modeling programs already used for a couple of decades. So in that sense, sort of the anime and manga industry is quite sort of often sort of at the forefront of tech integration. Interestingly enough, in this case, but we can see that also in other examples, not all of them, but many of them, is that Gen AI comes in particular moments of the creation process, but not everywhere. So it's mostly in background coloring, character sort of coloring that it really becomes important. But in manga and anime, so the key animation artists, which are the creative heart of the industry, still have a very important status and are still very involved in the production of these kinds of projects. That's actually not the case in this example. So this is a 2023 manga novel, Cyberpunk, which has been entirely generated through Midjourney, the quite well-known AI image generator. And the author of this novel actually admitted to have zero drawing talent. So this was really produced through prompts only. Another example, more recent. So this is the use of Gen AI to simulate voice actors' voices and to use Gen AI in translation. So this is basically an effort to replicate these voices in Japanese, but also to translate anime movies into English and Chinese specifically. So those are some of the main markets for these movies. And then this is an example from today, 2025, a new series which is set to debut this year. Two high school girls, which trying to make it big on TikTok, an anime movie, which is or series, sorry, which is 95% produced through Gen AI, with comic artists coming in to do quality control and editing. So still a little bit of involvement from sort of these well-known comic artists, but for a large part produced through generative AI. So these efforts are very much stimulated by the Japanese government, which is important. So in this is one example where they're arguing that it really generates very new opportunities to produce anime and manga content, especially at a time when there are labor shortages, which is something the industry is struggling with. Of course, not everyone's happy, as you can see also in other industries. In this particular case, anime and manga artists are very concerned about the way in which these generative AI models are trained on the basis of their content. So here this is a petition of Japanese anime and manga artists who sort of protest the use of their content without consent in the training of these models. So these kind of struggles are going on everywhere, right? You may be familiar with the New York Times suing OpenAI for copyright infringement, also because it has observed that, and other news organizations observed as well, that these large new um, generative AI models are trained on their copyrighted materials. And then the Japanese media are also critical and saying that the Japanese state is not doing enough to protect its artists and cultural workers. All right, so a couple of concepts which I think are important to think this through, right? So the first one would be this notion of labor precarity. So the use of Gen AI is obviously putting the jobs of background colorists, voice actors, translators, to some extent also comic artists at risk. Um, but at the same time, sort of the position of these really well-known anime and manga artists is ensured. So in this regard, it's important to observe that generative AI does not necessarily affect all job categories in one sector equally. And we think it's quite important to analytically break down the culture production process in these various stages, right? To think about it as not one thing, but think about it as generate potentially affecting green lighting phase, content scripting, video editing, visual effects, audio enhancement, background coloring, translation, circulation, marketing, and so on. So quite a few different phases which we really need to sort of explore and analyze separately rather than sort of make overall sort of, statements about the impact of Gen AI. And it's important to not just differentiate the process of cultural production, but also to think about the different contexts, socioeconomic, cultural contexts in which these technologies start intervening. And here we can look back at the research on platforms and cultural production, where researchers in the US and Europe have consistently observed that platforms and platformization undermine job security in the cultural industries, and that cultural work in sort of in the platform content is becoming highly precarious, which is also an argument we make in our book. But researchers working on other parts of the world, like rural China, Ghana, Brazil, have pointed out that precarity in their region is not necessarily a deviation from the norm, but rather a constant and long-standing feature. So in these economic conditions, platforms do not necessarily intensify precarity, but in certain cases enable marginalized individuals to become what some of our colleagues have called unlikely creative workers. So in other words, precarity is really a situated phenomena and derives its meaning from really this complex articulation of workers' experiences and also positions across a variety of economies. So how this issue of precarity plays out in the case of generative AI in different regions is really not yet clear. And we cannot assume that one region, whether it's Japan or the US or Poland or the Netherlands or Brazil, is the blueprint for other regions, right? We really need to have more sort of situated research to really understand these things. And a similar argument or similar sort of approach can be taken to this question of creativity. So one that comes up a lot when we think about generative AI in cultural production, with some sort of especially sort of popular media outlets arguing that sort of creativity is now taken over by generative AI models. We actually would like to argue that the question is not necessarily what creativity is, so whether it's artificial or human, but rather where it is, and not considered as necessarily one thing that's situated in the human or in the technology, but as something that's quite distributed, networked, if you will. So understanding creativity as a unique human cognitive trait really obscures the deeply material and technological and network nature of creative processes. Right? So this is very much a, if you will, an actor network perspective on understanding creativity, which always involves a wide variety of technologies, right? as it has in the past, right? If you think about filmmaking, it always involves cameras, scripting, sets, and so on, which are part of the creative process, which can't be sort of taken out of this idea of creativity. So in that sense, it needs to be thought of as networked and distributed. Um, and then, of course, the question is, so how this process, this networked and distributed process transforms once you start involving AI technologies in these different stages of cultural production. And of course, again, we need to think about, if we think about creativity as networked and distributed, we also need to think about in what kinds of environments these AI technologies are being integrated. So if you, again, think about the Japanese context, that's a context in which there is already a very, very high level of digital technology integration and a very rich ecosystem of AI startups, industry shows, expositions, workshops, also studios, media companies that are active in this particular context. So in this setting, um, creativity, or sort of the transformation of creativity through the integration of AI tools, takes a particular shape, right? One that will be quite different from contexts in which there is not a high level of digital technology integration, not a rich networks of AI startups, media companies, studios, and so on. So this is something which really requires quite a lot of sort of research to understand this. And then the final point, and then I'm closing my talk, is this notion of governance. So with the example of the manga and anime industry, we could see that the Japanese state, in close association with industry actors, is actually very much promoting the integration of AI in cultural production. But when you look around the globe, so the approach of governments and sort of governmental sort of collaborations has not been sort of the same across the board, right? So if you think about the European Union, which has been much more restrictive in terms of its approach to platforms, and now more recently also to AI. The AI Act is a good example of this, and has been rather strict in terms of how these technologies can be taken up. So in that sense, there are important differences between different parts of the world. We can see especially in East Asia, so Japan is an example, the Chinese state an even stronger example, where we can see very active intervention and governance, but also promotion of these technologies in the cultural sector. Where actually media companies, or sorry, platforms in the over the last couple of years have come to really resemble media companies much more strongly than sort of our definition of what a platform is. So in that sense, we feel it's really quite important to multiply our frames of reference to start understanding how governance works in these different parts of the world. So that's it for me. If you're sort of interested, especially sort of in the way we're trying to multiply our frames of reference, we wrote an introduction to a special issue of the International Journal of Cultural Studies, which has 20 papers from authors from around the world, we're trying to precisely do this, right? Develop more sort of situated approaches to understanding technology and cultural production, and multiplier frames of reference, developing what we call global perspectives. And the introduction, so if you look at the QR code or scan the QR code, you can find that introduction where we're developing the framework to do this. So thanks, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much,
And
Thomas.
hopefully more people can turn on their camera. That would be very nice.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, so I just kind of also would like to suggest you doing that. Thank you very much, Thomas. That was amazing. I have lots of questions and comments. I don't know if If I can ask all of them, perhaps not due to time limits.
Yeah.
Okay, but I would like to open the floor for discussions. So you can people in the on Zoom, you can type them, you can ask them using your own voice, and of course, people in the classroom are also invited to ask questions. So, okay, so anybody, anything, I'm opening the floor.
I'm really interested to hear whether this corresponds with things you're studying, how you're observing this in Poland. So love to hear your thoughts.
I
Okay.
have a small question.
Could you,
Can
great, thanks.
can
Could
you,
you maybe turn on your camera? Would that be okay?
unfortunately not. I'm on the move. I'm on
All
my
right,
phone. I
fine.
apologize.
Go ahead, no worries.
But you said that in East Asia, a lot, like in China, Japan, other countries, there's a lot of promotion of generative AI, and I was curious how much discussion there was about like intellectual property and consent
Yes.
with using generative AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, great question. Um, well, this is we're very much at the starting phase of this research, right? So in that sense, we haven't yet done the bulk of the research. But what we're seeing in the case of Japan is there's huge concerns, right, around copyright. So one of the slides I put up is this petition by manga and anime artists, comic sort of artists who are and so that so they've done some research on the percentages of people working on these industries who were concerned, and this is going up to the 70-80% of people working in this who are concerned that their work is actually used to train these models. And so, if you know anything about the way in which these generative AI models work, they're synthesizing, right? They're trained on and synthesizing the work that goes into their training, which then means that if you would like to develop a model that does a good job in sort of in this in a particular manga style or does a good job in developing anime, then you really need that content, right? You can't have a model that's trained on very other types of content. You need the content to be able to produce new synthetic content. So in that sense, those concerns are very legitimate. And that's also what these artists are pointing out. So they really want more protection of their intellectual property rights. And that's a struggle that's now ongoing, right? So but that's the case in Japan, but that's also the case in other parts of the world. And I think that's what we will see unfold over the next couple of years. My sense of this is that, again, as we've seen with the platform sort of markets, is that especially large media companies, so the large copyright holders, will be the winners in this. So they will start making deals with these generative AI companies to be able that they can use their copyright licensed to train their models, but a lot of other content that's out there, which is also going into these models, it will not actually be licensed, it will still be used, and those sort of copyright holders will lose out. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. And it's kind of, I will just kind of add a little comment here. Like last year, there was a story about Microsoft striking a deal with, I think, Simon and Schuster,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Uh,
Yeah.
have you heard about it? So just kind of briefly describing to those unfamiliar with this situation. So basically, Microsoft bought the rights to
Yeah.
Simon Schuster's, which is like one of the biggest publication
Exactly.
company in the world. And
Yeah.
what is so the Simon Schuster would sort of give access to all texts or literature,
Yes.
everything
Yeah.
they have published in the
Yeah.
history. And what is interesting is that there was a big problem because the artists said that nobody had contacted them beforehand.
Yes.
So they had
Mm.
not been asked by either Microsoft or Simon Schuster
Mm. Yes.
for the right to use their work. I'm not sure. Maybe Thomas, maybe you know if this has been resolved somehow.
I don't know. I don't know. No, I do. I know that. So these kind of deals are ongoing now. So you can. Another example is in France, where Le Monde made a deal with, I think, OpenAI. Similarly, right? So it's these large publishers that are able to make these deals, and then those that actually produce the content, right? So the journalists, artists, and so on, they're not consulted and often, of course, not compensated either, right? So and that's precisely what I'm putting. So, and this kind of goes back to earlier moments in these relations between tech companies and culture producers. Think back about YouTube and its a copyright identification system, which started to compensate copyright holders, which had uploaded their content, but not necessarily those that were starting to remix that content, right? Which were producing new original content. And that's been an ongoing concern, sort of in the creator economy for, well, a decade, and it really hasn't been resolved. So it's in many of these cases, those that are able to make these deals, that have these partner programs and so on, that can profit, and then many others lose out.
Yeah, yeah, and this kind of ties in with the idea that with the kind of estimations that by the 2030, all these AI companies will have read the whole internet. That's why there's kind of a scramble for more and more content. So I think these deals will be more and more common between publication companies, between universities, libraries,
Yes.
the journalists, so kind of newspapers and so on and so forth.
Yeah, this is really a super interesting area of research where I think so this pertains to indeed to the content that's out there and that sort of there are copyright deals going to be made. But what is interesting now as well is that on the basis of these that content models have been produced, which then start producing synthetic content,
Yeah,
which can't really be retraced back to any original content, but which are very important for the training of new models because simply there isn't enough data or content available
yeah,
to train these very large models.
yeah.
So it becomes really a very complicated modeled situation. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's sort of there is a question from Hannah,
Yes.
and I will sort of read it out in a minute. I would like just ask one more kind of a follow-up question, like one of
Yeah.
many I have. The thing of the precarity thing. Because, for example, like ChatGPT offers, like or Perplexity AI offers summary of your search. Like so, as opposed to Google search, when you have the list of links that and you can directly access the
Sure.
source, you can directly
Yeah.
access the
Yeah.
creator.
Yeah.
These days, right? You
Yeah.
don't you or in the future, you won't have to do that because AI will generate a summary for you. And
Yeah.
this leads up to the precarity because you have the content created by someone uh, regardless of the level of professionalism of that content. But you don't go to that content itself, but you just read the summary of it. Which, as we know, right, people monetize their output on the internet because of the clicks,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Once these clicks stop coming because people would just read the news on AI search engine. This leads to even a higher level of precarity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. No,
It's
absolutely, you're right. I mean, those were very much the concerns from the get-go when Google was thinking of sort of producing an AI sort of driven search engine, and Bing was doing the same thing, right, in collaboration with OpenAI. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really a restructuring of the online economy, where indeed, sort of so far, so that the platform model is really where you have these billions of end users, and then millions of content producers, and the platform really starts connecting them. But in most cases, you're actually then taken to the website where the which is under control of the original, so the one that produces the content, uh, and then that entity can profit, right, from the from traffic and subscribers potentially, or advertisement on the site, and this is especially the case for news organizations. And that model is sort of being shaken up now. And for precisely for that reason, sort of news organizations are super concerned, right? So they're protesting this use. And I think the way probably forward for them is to prohibit these tech companies to use their content to train their models, right? So it's news. I mean, news content. The good thing about news content is that it's always new, right? So it's constantly being produced. So in that sense, these AI companies would really need a license of with these companies to be able to integrate that into their model, right? To be able to produce the results that are up to date, that are really reflecting the current news situation. So I think that's a huge concern. So news organizations do have opportunities to fight back, right? And they're realizing that they have opportunities to fight back.
Exactly. Like you mentioned Le Monde.
Yeah, exactly.
Like no, this is a big entity, but
Yeah,
about all these individuals, right? Who,
it's more difficult for sure.
right?
But I think that's a concern that has been ongoing for, again, I think a lot of these things have been with us for a while now, where you could see that sort of the big brands were doing well, as I said, right, in the platform economy, and then many smaller ones were losing out, right? They were losing out in terms of visibility, but we're now at a stage where I think a lot of news organizations have realized that with this overabundance of content online, they should really try to find their niche, right? So produce sort of original content, unique content that is, for example, local news organization providing really local content, which is not being developed by these larger news brands. Uh, and so that's where there's going to be their niche, and where they can potentially, hopefully, attract subscribers to be able to finance what they're doing. And so, and even the larger news brands like the New York Times are really focused on developing a large online subscriber base, rather than trying to build a business model on platform advertising, which is certainly not something that's going to work. So I think similar sort of questions come up with generative AI, where the challenge is really to find a unique niche and to protect your content, right? Really protect it against being used in training of these models.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so question from Hannah. I will just read it out. I'd like to ask about your predictions regarding the future of Gen AI. There have been voices saying that in regards to animation, even though it's capable of creating, it doesn't adhere to the principles of animation and lacks the quote human touch. Do you believe that Gen AI will continue to pose bigger risks to cultural creators, compromising quality for mass production of content?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is a very central debate in the Japanese anime manga industry, where these especially a couple of famous artists have pointed out really it lacks indeed what you said, right? The human touch, and it won't be able to produce that. So again, I think for this reason, it's so important to think about the integration of generative AI in these cultural creation process as something that's very distributed and networked, right? So I think it's simply the wrong approach to think about the creation, in this case, of anime, manga, as simply something that is done by Gen AI, because that's not the case, right? So uh, it's not an either or question. So it's not either humans producing this or these models producing it. It's really often a combination of these things, right? So first off, in a very simple sense, these models are obviously trained, right, on decades of human content that's being produced. So in that sense, it already sort of synthesizes sort of that creativity. But if you look at sort of many of these, the ways in which this is now being integrated, it's uh, uh, in particular aspects of the creative process, right? So it's in background coloring, it's in creating sort of uh, 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 well, coloring characters in translation, these kinds of things it's being integrated in, and then that always continues to involve um, well, human artists, right? Which I mean, the series which I refer to in my example, which is going to be launched this year, 2025. They're saying about 95% of the cuts are being produced through Gen AI, but then it also involves, right, these comic artists to add or make sure, maybe that's a better way to put it, make sure that that there is this human touch, right? That it and that there's quality control and that certain things are made more authentic, more realistic, and so on. So I really think you need to think about this as a complex distributed process rather than one that's simply AI or human. And I think we're going to see many, many different hybrids and many aspects of the creative process, right? So for that reason, also, I think it's very important to think about the creative process, not one thing, but involving quite a few different stages. Um, as I said, right? So green lighting, developing, coloring, translation, and so on. So yeah, I think that's probably the more fruitful approach and one that's also really, I think, interesting to study.
So kind of follow up to the human touch thing. And I have this kind of a optimistic take that perhaps,
That's very welcome, honestly.
yeah, perhaps the popularity of AI generated content, be it manga, be it movies, be whatever, translations and books, maybe it's just kind of hype. Like people just read, watch, and whatever that they do with AI generated stuff just to see how it works, what it looks, what it feels like, right? And at some point, people just lose the interest. I mean, okay, so that's great. Technology has moved us there. It looks really nice, really kind of breathtaking, or fake, because sometimes when it comes to AI generated things, you just see that they are AI, and you just don't sort of in any way engage with let's say videos or pictures. So perhaps the human touch is this feature that will remain and
Hmm.
actually at one point uh, sort of replace the AI generated content because we'll have been saturated with this,
Hmm.
and what we will need is this kind of human authentic
Mm.
spirits in
I see. I
in the
see.
world, right?
Yeah.
If I'm making myself clear, but
No, you're it's absolutely clear. So I think you're right in the sense that I do think that sort of cultural creative workers will always be involved, right? So, but I think so. So what I'm trying to get at is that we shouldn't think about it as one or the other. And so what I think and what we've seen with other sort of technological changes is that it starts to intervene in particular moments, elements of the creative process. So if you think about computer-generated imagery, right? So that was, I mean, I think I remember in the 1980s, 1990s, it was first starting to be introduced, and initially it was indeed, as you said, a sort of a gimmick. People were interested to see it, um, and then people kind of lost interest. But then computer-generated imagery, right, is everywhere today, right? It's everywhere, but it's not maybe not so in your face, but it's sort of weaved through, integrated in particular moments, elements, and so on. So, and I think the same thing will happen with generative AI, where we lose indeed sort of the gimmick aspect of it, but it's certainly going to be integrated in loads of moments of creation, as well as loads of moments in academia, right? Which we're very much part of, and it's maybe not going to be everywhere that obvious, but it will shift the way in which work is being done, what kind of work is being made available, uh, who is profiting, right, from the integration of these technologies. So all of those questions will come up,
Yeah.
even though, we're not going to be in a future which is completely AI driven. And I think that's indeed, in many cases, that's not going to be the case, but it's still going to really transform economies. It's still going to
Yeah.
transform work processes and so on.
Okay. Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions?
Maybe the students behind you also.
Maybe? Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
So maybe I was wondering if you
Yeah.
would agree and maybe not agree. Anyway, I feel like before the AI boom, there was this narrative that the jobs most endangered by AI will be from the IT sector.
Yeah.
And now, when after the boom, after we have so many AI engines, apps, platforms, I feel like the most affected is this creative, artistic
Yeah.
sector. And I was maybe wondering if this is a result of the technocrats, which often stand behind the
Mm, mm,
AI platforms, and how maybe it's very conspiracy
mm,
theorist.
mm.
Okay.
No, I mean, I don't think I don't think necessarily particular sort of bad or uh, evil actors are sort of to be, blamed for this necessarily. I think it's I think it's more fruitful to think about sort of where sort of huge technological shifts are happening. So the way in which AI is now starting to intervene in creative work is really the result of what people, well, in doing this research, called the deep learning paradigm, right? So these deep learning models, which have really sort of gone through a huge development over the last decades, which have been enabled by particular sort of technological shifts and to some extent also breakthroughs, right? Where it's been possible to start training these models on a very large scale, also in parallel to each other. So and also an increase in sort of compute availability, which really shifted the way in which AI is being developed. And so we're seeing sort of machine learning, deep learning becoming very, very sort of dominant as a paradigm in AI research and then AI application. And that is a model that just trains on loads of cultural content, data, uh, or more generally just sort of social content, and then starts replicating that, right? And then it starts affecting obviously those aspects of the world where that data is coming from, right? And that's the cultural sector, but it also is academia, right? So we're hugely impacted by this, as you know, right? So it's academics are now struggling with students who are massively taking up these models to produce essays, theses and so on, and we have to deal with this. So this transforms the way in which we teach, the way we assess also content. And this is not something I think which we can find other ways to do. I mean, other ways to assess, other ways to teach, but this is not going to stop, right? So, and I don't think that's the result of indeed technocrats pushing certain things. It's really part of a larger sort of technological transformation, which obviously, yes, there are huge investments being made, right, to push those technologies further, right? There's billions and billions of dollars being invested in the development of these technologies that enable them to be developed at this scale. So in that sense, yes, it does come from, you know, certain companies, certain individuals sort of running these companies, but it is something that is more fundamental and more sort of really restructuring entire economies than it's just a couple of people, evil technocrats pushing this. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Okay, maybe one more question from me, if
Yeah.
I may.
Yeah, great.
How do you think European Union regulations such as AI Acts or DSA Act, for example, how successful they are or might be in somehow, you know, harnessing, controlling Gen AI models these days?
Yeah.
Can they be
Yeah.
successful?
Yeah. I think I mean these regulatory frameworks are obviously not perfect, right? So there are always lots of complications with them. But at the same time, I think it's absolutely essential that states intervene in terms of sort of regulating these technologies in ways that correspond with sort of basic human rights, public values that are central to, you know, the way we've organized societies, right? So, and now I'm speaking from a European perspective, which would be sort of a liberal social democratic sort of traditions, where things like equality, diversity, inclusion, and I'm actually explicitly naming these things because they're so under sort of threat at the moment in the United States, are really important to protect. And if we don't protect them, these large tech companies are going to undermine these values, right? Are going to not take care of the rights of particular cultural producers. They're not going to make sure that the content which we're getting is going to reflect the diversity of societies. And what we'll see is winner take all sort of dynamics again sort of playing out. So I think the DSA, DMA, AI Act are absolutely essential. And I think and I think we have to start preparing for a war in that regard, right? So there's going to be a huge pressure from the large US tech companies to make these laws either go away or at least not being enforced. And the US government is going to assist them in that effort in at least the next couple of years. And that's Europe is going to have to confront that. And that's not going to be easy. So it's really we're looking towards a couple of years, coming years, which are going to be quite dark, I think, in that regard. But absolutely, it's absolutely essential that Europe develops these legislative initiatives.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas, very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for being in this classroom.
Great.
Right there on Zoom. Stay tuned for other events in the series. There will be one more this semester. Thomas, thank you very much for your amazing talk and very food for thought talk, something that we will be discussing in this classroom and perhaps around the world as well.
Great. Nice. Well, thank you very much for having me. And everyone, well, if you have questions, you can always mail me. It's easy to find me. And thanks for being here. Great.
Thank you. Have a good day, Thomas. Take
You
care.
too. Bye-bye. Bye.